Good evening, everybody. My name is Sebastian Lay. I'm the Chief Advancement Officer here at the MBL. What that means less than what I have to say. But I'm glad to see a number of folks who we saw earlier this evening at the Captain Kidd. Very appropriate choice. Good job, everybody. I don't take any money from the Captain Kidd, so it's just an observation. I would ask you, please, as I usually do, to please silence your cell phones this evening. The penalty is a little more serious, and this isn't necessarily historically correct to the period of time we'll be hearing about tonight, but Eel Pond is right there, and if one of your phones rings, you know where you're going. So, the Falmouth Forum is supported in part and in large part by the Friends of the MBL and their efforts to provide a community connection for the laboratory. It, as you know, spans science, culture, history, etc. And that's in part due to the generosity of many of you in this crowd. So first, thank you. For those of you who donate, and I'd encourage you to keep that up because we really enjoy making these types of programs available to the community, and we think that you do too. And with that, I will introduce this evening's introducer, John Stegman, who chairs the Friends of the MBL board and works tirelessly to help advance the mission of this great institution. So enjoy.
All right. Thank you, Sebastian. As you know, my name is John Stegman, and many of you who know me know that I'm affiliated officially as a faculty member at Huey, but chairing the board for the MBL Friends is really a reflection of my love for this institution as well as the Oceanographic Institution for the incredible, impactful discoveries made by both institutions, and this one is particularly rich in its history of incredible discovery in the biomedical and molecular sciences. It's a wonderful place. How many of you have been to a Falmouth Forum? Excuse me, how many have not been to a Falmouth Forum before? Please raise your hand. Okay, a fair number. So you are now casual friends of the MBL. We encourage you to become official friends of the MBL, and by donation, you can be such. So please do that. It's my real pleasure this evening to introduce Eric Dolin, and I've got some notes here about Eric. I think we're very fortunate. He's written a wonderful book on pirates. Who doesn't love pirates? Well, he's going to dispel some of your favorite romantic impressions of pirates. I hope not all of them, and especially for my wife and son who are here because they claim pirates, 2 of them, in their family history. Probably a lot of you do as well. I want to tell you a bit about Eric Dolin. He has a long and very interesting career and an educational pedigree that's really quite sterling. So he grew up in Connecticut, he grew up on the coast, he went to Brown University and got a master's degree in environmental management from Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Sciences, and then a PhD in environmental policy and planning from MIT. So he's got a good pedigree. What's he doing writing about pirates? Well, he had a great career in science policy. He worked as a program manager at the EPA. He worked for the Environmental Resources Limited as an intern for the National Wildlife Federation, for the Office of Coastal Zone Management, and for Senator Lowell Weicker on Capitol Hill, fisheries policy analyst for the Fisheries Service, technical writer for the National Transportation Safety Board, a Pew Research Fellow at Harvard Law School, and a AAAS Mass Media Science and Engineering Fellow. Now, what's he doing writing about pirates? Well, he also has some history in Woods Hole. He was an intern, a summer intern in John Teal's lab at the Oceanographic in 1981. That led him away from laboratory science, apparently, to policy But in 2007, he said, I want to write books. So he's written books, and not just the pirate book. He wrote a number of books that have received awards. The Duck Stamp Story received the gold medal for books by the American Philatelic Association. Brilliant Beacons, A History of American Lighthouses, the best nautical book of 2016. When America First Met China, a gold medal for history in 2013. Fur, Fortune, and Empire, Epic History of the Fur Trade, won a 2010 James Hanlon Book Award. And Leviathan, History of Whaling in America, won the 2007 John Lyman Award. So he is not only knowledgeable about pirates, but he knows a lot about a lot of things. And I think we're in for a real treat because, as I said earlier, who doesn't love pirates? Eric Dolin.
Thank you. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. I hope I can live up to it. And I didn't mean to have John Teal be thrown under the bus like that. I also worked for Ivan Valiella. I was a guest student, and I just decided that being a research scientist is not something that I would do very well. So while I was a guest student, I was a cook at night at the Fishmonger Cafe, which probably a lot of you know. So after 2 months of working as a guest student and studying the nutritional habits of Euca pugnax, the fiddler crab, I left the lab and I just cooked at the Fishmonger, and I hung out at Nopska Beach all day. So I had a great time. So anyway, thank you very much for coming out here. I really appreciate it. Now, pirates have long been among the most colorful and memorable celebrities in popular culture. And of course, much of this has to do with books that use pirates as a motif. And of course, the most famous example of that is Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island, which was published in 1883. Stevenson weaves a wonderfully dramatic tale of the search for pirate treasure, replete with a map of Skeleton Island on which an X, actually 3 red crosses of ink, mark the spot where the loot is to be found. Treasure Island is also the book that gave us that familiar sea shanty refrain, 15 men on the dead man's chest, yo-ho-ho and a bottle of rum, drinking the devil had done for the rest, yo-ho-ho and a bottle of rum, and now you know why I'm a writer and not a singer. So, now movies have also had a major impact on how we view pirates, none more so than the Pirates of the Caribbean franchise, which has generated a renewed pirate mania. With all these cultural references, it's no wonder then that pirate costumes are among the most popular donned on Halloween night, and legions of fans celebrate International Talk Like a Pirate Day every September 19th. There's no denying it. Pirates have grabbed hold of our collective imagination. Many have daydreamed about leaving traditional society behind, boarding a ship and throwing in their lot with the hardy men and women intent on taking what they want and getting rich, while enjoying the luxurious freedom of sailing the world's oceans with a hold full of rum. Mark Twain captured this longing in his memoir, Life on the Mississippi, when he admitted that even though he and his friends had one permanent ambition, to be steamboatmen, now and then we had a hope that if we lived and were good, God would permit us to be pirates. Historians can certainly poke holes in fictional representations of pirates, especially those that depict them as unnaturally attractive, rakish yet good-natured rapscallions, having a grand old time looking for love, adventure, and treasure on the waves. The reality of piracy is nothing like the musings of this New York Times reporter in 1892, who complained, "It cannot but be a source of regret to every true lover of the picturesque that pirates are no more, and piracy has lost its popularity. What tremendous fellows they must have been. What heroes, dandies, wits were to be found among them. They were immensely superior to land brigands who are mere milk compared with Blackbeard and Captain Kidd." While real pirates were incredibly intriguing and compelling characters, they were most definitely not tremendous fellows. Instead, they were seaborne criminals who were neither endearing nor heroic. Now, Black Flags, Blue Waters cuts through the imagery and mythology surrounding pirates and tells the dramatic and surprising history of American piracy's golden age, which spanned the late 1600s through the early 1700s, when lawless pirates plied the coastal waters of North America and beyond. And to give you a better idea of what is in the book, I am going to read a short excerpt from the introduction. The Golden Age was the most dramatic era of maritime marauding the world has ever known. It produced such iconic characters as Captain William Kidd and Blackbeard, along with thousands of other pirates whose names are less familiar, but whose despicable deeds are often just as riveting. Much has been written about that time period, and this book adds to that literary lineage, but with a twist. Rather than focusing broadly on this era, Black Flags, Blue Waters zeroes in on the history of the pirates who either operated out of America's English colonies or plundered ships along the American coast. From the early 1680s to 1726, these pirates had an exceedingly close, often tempestuous, and frequently deadly relationship with the colonies. While this arrangement began with a warm and financially lucrative embrace, it eventually ended in a bloody war against pirates, punctuated by scores of hangings from Boston to Charleston. At its most elemental, Black Flags, Blue Waters is about men acting like oceanic gamblers, playing the risky and sometimes fatal game of preying on merchant ships in search of treasure. Most pirates failed to achieve great financial success and had brief careers that often ended in violent death, but that was not always the case. This book is also a history of intimidation and at times extreme brutality. Pirates were almost always able to rely on the threat of force to get their victims to submit without violence, but when that approach failed, pirates were willing to fight for what they coveted. And this is the penultimate scene of Blackbeard's life. We'll talk about that more later. This is likewise a story of political intrigue and collusion. In the late 1600s, many colonists heartily encouraged and supported pirates, though such activities flouted English law. Those colonists viewed pirates not as dangerous raiders, but as commercial angels and as friends and family who enabled the colonies to obtain the goods and money they so desperately desired, despite the onerous trade restrictions put in place by the mother country. Finally, Black Flags, Blue Waters is about crackdowns, punishment, and eradication. Reacting to the growing problem of piracy, in the late 1600s, England launched political, legal, and naval initiatives that had considerable success in countering the pirate threat. And I just want to add this engraving from the early 1800s of Captain Kidd's ending at the mouth of the Thames. He didn't look quite that good in reality. They actually slathered his body in a thick layer of tar so that he would remain, the semblance of his shape would remain for the 10 to 15 years that this was hanging at the mouth of the Thames to serve as a warning to other seafarers. Now, but in the mid-17 teens, piracy experienced a resurgence, and the number of pirates exploded. More than ever before, they focused their depredations on British ships traveling along the coast of the American colonies. Once viewed by many colonists and their official representatives in a favorable light, pirates were now increasingly viewed as mortal enemies who posed a grave threat to trade. Through a combination of legal, political, and military means, pirates were virtually eliminated by the middle of the 1720s. Many people view pirates in a romantic light, but there was absolutely nothing romantic about them, other than the legends woven about their exploits after they were gone. That is not to say that pirates were boring. Far from it. While the pirates of Black Flags, Blue Waters can't compete with the magnetic charms and witty repartee of Captain Jack Sparrow, they are compelling characters nonetheless. And the real story of America's pirates is even more astonishing and fascinating than any fictional pirate adventure ever written or cast on the silver screen. Now, people often ask how I come up with the topics for my books. After my last book, Brilliant Beacons, A History of the American Lighthouse, I decided to try something different. I pitched a couple of ideas to my two kids, Lily and Harry, who were shown here about 4 years ago on the steps of a whaling captain's mansion on Nantucket. So I gave them a couple of ideas, but when I mentioned the possibility of writing about pirates, their eyes lit up, and they said, "That is it. You have got to write a book about pirates." And I got really excited because I've written 13 books, and neither of my kids has read a single one of them. So I figured this is my one chance to get my kids to read the book. And I have to say, because my daughter asked me to say this, that since the book has come out, she read it and she likes it. My son, however, who's a freshman in college, has only promised to read it by the time he's 50. So I don't know what's going to happen. So anyway, and my daughter actually gave me two potential titles for the book. One was Swords, Sails, and Swashbucklers. The other one was Arg or R, which I had to tell Lily, much to her chagrin, is not a phrase or word that any golden age pirate likely ever uttered. It's more of a byproduct of Hollywood movies from the mid-1900s, in particular, an actor named Robert Newton, an English actor who played Blackbeard and Long John Silver and dispensed args and I mateys and shiver me timbers with relish. Now, when I began working on this book, I knew very little about pirates, but that was by design. Every single book I've written, with one exception, has been on a topic I knew almost nothing about before I began. And the reason I do that, it takes me about 18 months to 2 years to write one of these books. And I want to remain engaged and interested. And I figure one of the easiest ways to do that is to pick a topic I don't know a lot about, because then I'll continually find surprises, and hopefully some of that excitement will translate to the written page. Now, sure, I had seen a number of movies that use pirates as a theme, including all the Pirates of the Caribbean movies, as well as Muppets Treasure Island, The Goonies, Hook, and even The Princess Bride, with its repeated references to the dread pirate Roberts. What is that? Never toy with a Sicilian when death is on the line, or something like that. Anyway, but I hadn't read any books about pirates, not even Treasure Island. And this will probably strike a positive chord with you in this audience. When I was a kid, what did I read a lot of? Scientific American. My dad was a physicist. So I knew what pirates dreamed about, the big score, finding a ship with a hold full of silver pieces of 8 and gold doubloons. I had heard of Blackbeard, but I really didn't know much about him other than the obvious fact that he had a black beard. I had also heard of Captain Kidd, but the only thing I knew about him is that he supposedly buried treasure up and down the East Coast, from Delaware all the way to Oak Island, Nova Scotia. Of course, that is a total myth, but it hasn't stopped many people spending years and a lot of money searching for Captain Kidd's hidden hoard, but coming up empty. And it was very appropriate to eat at Captain Kidd. And that mural on the wall was fascinating. And I didn't want to mention, I'm glad the owner didn't come over and say, "Oh, you the guy that's wrote the book about pirates?" Because they've got a piece of parchment painted onto the wall which talks about Captain Kidd's buried treasure. Now, I'd also heard that pirates drank a lot, especially rum, which qualified as the pirates' drink of choice. And you'll be happy to hear that that fact is 100% true. One pirate even admitted that the love of drink and a lazy life were stronger motives than gold in drawing him into piracy. Unfortunately, he said that a couple of hours before he was hanged. Now, one of the earliest talks I gave on this book was out in Oregon, in Coos Bay, and a local rum distillery co-sponsored the talk. So there were 14 types of rum out and ready for imbibing before I started speaking. And I think that talk went the best of any of my talks. Now, the more I learned about pirates, however, the more fascinated I became. Pirates were an important part of American history, and their story was more complicated and intriguing than I suspected. The first known instance of piracy along the coast of the American colonies happened in the summer of 1632, when a pirate named Dixie Bull and his men attacked a few English vessels off the New England coast, and then they disappeared from sight. Other than that, the main connection the colonies had with piracy during the mid-1600s was twofold. First, many American merchants went down to the Caribbean and sold pirates' goods. And in turn, many pirates came up from the Caribbean and settled in the American colonies. In 1684, for example, Jamaican Governor Sir Thomas Lynch noted that the northern colonies are now full of pirates' money. Pirates had, Lynch claimed, carried the equivalent of 80,000 pounds sterling into Boston alone, a city that one English official labeled as the common receptacle of pirates of all nations. And to give you an idea of how much 80,000 pounds is, this is a time when a captain of a successful merchant ship might only pull down 72 pounds a year. Does anybody know who this is? Speaking about rum. Right, yes, Henry Morgan. The mid-1600s is also the era of the Buccaneers, when men like Henry Morgan roamed the Caribbean in search of Spanish treasure ships to plunder. The ships were full of silver and gold that came from the mines in Central and South America. The most productive mint was established in 1575 in the Incan city of Potosi in modern-day Bolivia, at the foot of what the Spanish called Cerro Rico, or Rich Mountain. The mints at Potosi and in Mexico produced copious quantities of coins, including gleaming gold doubloons, and most importantly, 8 real coins, those so-called pieces of 8, or Spanish silver dollars, which became the first truly global currency. Now, the Buccaneers' favorite haunt was Port Royal on the English island of Jamaica. Arguably the wealthiest city in the New World by 1680, Port Royal's, it's right around there, Port Royal's veneer of sophistication could not hide its decidedly sleazy underbelly. This is when, you don't really want that said about your town, but anyway, this is when Port Royal gained the well-earned reputation as the wickedest city in the world and the Sodom of the West Indies. An unsavory melange of buccaneers and privateers prowled Port Royal's streets and alleyways in search of liquid and carnal pleasure. As one buccaneer said of his peers, whenever they've got hold of something, they don't keep it for long. They're busy dicing, whoring, and drinking, so long as they have anything to spend. Some of them will get through a good 2,000 or 3,000 pieces of 8 in a day, and the next day not have a shirt on their back. He continued, my own master used to buy a butt of wine and set it in the middle of the street with the barrel head knocked in and stand barring the way. Every passerby had to drink with him, or he'd have shot them dead with the gun he kept handy. I always thought that would be an effective means to sell more of my books. Anyway, on June 7, 1692, a devastating earthquake hit Jamaica, and when it was all over, nearly 2/3 of Port Royal was underneath the waves, and the death toll approached 5,000, many of them Buccaneers. In the gruesome aftermath, hundreds of dead and bloated bodies were floating on the surface of the harbor and were washed up on shore. A local minister who survived the earthquake called it a terrible judgment of God that was brought down upon the heads of the most ungodly, debauched people in the world. By the late 1600s, Buccaneers had been replaced by the so-called Red Seamen, who came from the colonies, went around the Cape of Good Hope, into the Indian Ocean, where they attacked ships traveling between India, Mughal ships, Muslim ships, traveling between India and the Red Sea ports of Jeddah and Mocha. On the surface, Red Sea men appeared to be nothing more than privateers. For a fee, they'd been issued privateering licenses or letters of marque by colonial governors, which gave them permission to attack French ships, since at the time, England and France were at war. But those governors knew full well that the Red Sea men had no intention of attacking the French, but instead were going to the Indian Ocean to attack rich Mughal ships. Red Sea men were the most successful of all pirates, with some of them, such as Henry Avery here, amassing considerable fortunes. Avery's greatest success was capturing the Ganja Saway, which was one of the Emperor Aurangzeb's largest ships. It had on board 1,000 pilgrims who were heading to Mecca on the annual Hajj. Now, the pirates plundered the ship for several days. When they weren't gathering loot, they engaged in an animalistic and vile orgy, viciously raping numerous women. A few of the intended victims, unable to bear the humiliation of having their families and friends see them ravished and defiled, killed themselves with daggers or jumped into the ocean to their death. Despite this horrific behavior, the Red Sea men were welcomed with open arms in America because they were, in many cases, accepted and much beloved members of the colonies from which they sailed. They were the sons, fathers, and brothers who chose to better their lives and the lives of their families by robbing quote-unquote infidels and heathens halfway around the world and bringing their riches back home. While in the Indian Ocean, the Red Sea men used the small island of Saint Marie, it's right up there off the larger island of Madagascar, as their home base. There was plenty of gambling on the island. With one pitch of the die, a pirate from New York earned 1,300 pieces of 8. There were also plenty of fights. In one brawl, 14 men who were really disappointed with the small amount of treasure they managed to bring back from their latest voyage squared off 7 on a side to fight to see who would get the money. All 7 men on one side were killed, and 5 of the 7 on the other side were slain. And the last 2, I guess they just looked at each other and said, "That's enough, we're going to split the money." Now, although the Red Sea men were welcomed in the colonies, the British Parliament and the Crown despised them. Not only did pirates break the law, but they also threatened the entire East Indian trade, which is so vital to the British economy. The resulting crackdown on pirates used a combination of stricter laws, more effective prosecutions, naval attacks on pirate ships, and increased hangings to greatly reduce the pirate threat in the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean by the beginning of the 1700s. This general reprieve from piracy lasted from 1702 to 1713 during the War of the Spanish Succession. The only significant case of piracy in the colonies originated in my hometown of Marblehead, Massachusetts, where a guy named John Quelch and his men killed the captain of the privateer ship they were on, pitched him over the side, left from Marblehead, went down to Brazil, plundered a bunch of ships, killed one captain of a ship, and came back with 10,000 pounds worth of gold dust. But when they returned in 1704, there was a massive manhunt from Boston to the Isle of Shoals, and they were caught. Many of the pirates were caught, and they were hanged on Friday, June 30th, 1704, at the edge of Boston Harbor. Thousands of people came out to see them swing into eternity, including this person. Does anybody know who this is? What? I thought I heard it. Cotton Mather. Cotton Mather. Probably the most famous person in the colonies at the time, and a famous Puritan preacher. Cotton Mather showed up at almost every pirate hanging. He stood up and steadied himself in a boat just offshore to deliver his sermon. He said, "We the ministers have told you often, yea, we have told you weeping, that you have by sin undone yourselves. We have shown you how to commit yourself into his saving and healing hands, and how to express repentance. We can do no more, but leave you in his merciful hands." When the scaffold platform was pulled away and the men dropped to their death, the screams of the crowd were so loud that they were heard more than a mile away. A few years after the end of the war, piracy came roaring back, inaugurating the second major period of American piracy, which lasted from 1715 to 1726, when as many as 4,000 pirates were active. And this time, the major focus of activity was not the Red Sea, but rather the coastal waters off the American colonies, as well as the Caribbean. There are many reasons for this explosion in piracy. A significant number of Navy men and privateers who lost their job with the cessation of the war turned to piracy. Other men who had despotic captains mutinied, killed their captains, and turned to piracy as well. And then there was a major disaster off of Vero Beach in Florida. 14 Spanish treasure ships within sight of land sank to the bottom of the ocean. And when that news radiated throughout the Atlantic, thousands of people, would-be treasure hunters, came to dive on the wrecks. And whether they were successful or not, many of them stayed in the Caribbean and adopted the pirate life. Although many men voluntarily signed on to become pirates, others were forced to go on the account, becoming pirates against their will. Now, 1715 to 1726 is also the period when pirates used the black flag, or the Jolly Roger, as their terrifying calling card. The black flag was intended to strike fear into the hearts of sailors who spied it fluttering atop the masts of the pirate ship, sending the unmistakable message, surrender immediately or else we'll attack. Being risk-averse, pirates always hoped for surrender. They never wanted to fight if they could avoid it because there was no upside to battle. Fortunately for the pirates, they rarely had to resort to force since intimidation, courtesy of the black flag, worked so well. Now, this is a representation of the black flag of Edward Lowe, Pirate Captain Edward Lowe. I'm going to talk about a little bit later. Now, of course, the skeleton indicates death, as does the dart or the harpoon, puncturing the heart with 3 drops of blood emanating from it. And then the hourglass raised aloft means that your time is fast running out to make a decision, so choose wisely. This is also when pirates voted in democratic fashion to determine who would be their captain, where they would go to hunt for prizes, and which ships they would attack. This is also when pirates signed the Articles of Agreement, or the Notorious Pirate Code, which laid out the rules for their behavior and also mandated the virtually even distribution of treasure among the crew. This is when many black men served as pirates. From the available evidence, it seems that many of them were captured African slaves who continued to be slaves on pirate ships or were resold to generate some money. But that's only part of the story. There's also plenty of evidence that many black pirates became valued crew members who fought alongside their white pirate brethren and shared equally in the spoils. Now, this is when Anne Bonny and Mary Read, the only 2 women known to have been on pirate ships during the Golden Age, appear briefly on history's stage. Both were put on trial in Port Royal, Jamaica, for being part of Calico Jack Rackham's crew, and Bonny also happened to be Rackham's lover. Their trials in Jamaica are memorable not only for the multiple hangings that ensued, but even more so for the legal gambit used by Bonny and Read. The court found them guilty of piracy, and they were condemned to be hanged. Immediately after the sentence was handed down, however, the 2 women pleaded their bellies, informing the court that they were pregnant. And when the court determined that that in fact was the case, it gave them both temporary stays of execution. On the day that Rackham went to the gallows, Bonny made it clear that she was extremely disappointed in her erstwhile lover, saying that she was sorry to see him there, but if he had fought like a man, he need not have been hanged like a dog. As for the ladies, Read died in jail from an unspecified illness soon thereafter, and Bonny simply disappeared from the historical record. This is when Edward Thatch, better known as Blackbeard, and 400 of his men blockaded Charleston, South Carolina, and terrorized the rest of the coast with their exploits. Here's another myth, I hate to tell you, but Blackbeard did not go into battle with flames shooting out from his head, as was written by Captain Charles Johnson in 1724. It was supposed to make him more fearsome and demonic, his face wreathed in smoke. But just think about it. How dumb would it be to go into battle with flames shooting out in close proximity to your hair? And there's not a single extant account of this being the case. Now, Blackbeard met his grisly end at the hands of British Naval Lieutenant Robert Maynard, whose forces battled him off Ocracoke Island. After the battle was over, Maynard severed Blackbeard's head and hung it from the bowsprit of his sloop. Blackbeard's headless body was pitched into the murky waters of Pamlico Sound, where, according to legend, it took a few laps around the sloop before sinking from sight. There are a lot of legends and myths when it comes to pirates. Now, Blackbeard's story recently came full circle because in 1996, divers found the remains of Blackbeard's flagship, Queen Anne's Revenge, in the shallow waters of Beaufort Inlet. And they started recovering treasure. Now, this is also when the pirate named Stede Bonnet, a wealthy sugar plantation owner from Barbados, decided to give up his comfortable life and become a pirate, or the gentleman pirate, as he is often called. He even built his own pirate ship, and he had the captain's cabin lined with bookshelves so he could bring along his own personal library. Now, it's not clear why Bonnet took the dramatic career action of becoming a pirate. Some have speculated that he was depressed or perhaps insane, but others have traced its origins to some discomforts that he found in his married life. And if that's the case, he had a really bad marriage. Now, on his own and in league with Blackbeard, Bonnet had some success as well as many more failures. He was finally captured in late September of 1718 by Colonel William Rhett and his men near the mouth of the Cape Fear River. The trial of Bonnet and his men, held at Charleston, South Carolina, was a sensational affair. Not only did Bonnet and one of his men escape, only to be recaptured a short while later, but Bonnet's supporters in town threatened to burn Charleston to the ground if he wasn't released, arguing in part that Bonnet, like many of them, was an upper crust kind of guy, and he should be sent off to gain the mercy of the king. But the court disagreed, tried him, found him guilty, and hanged him and his men at the edge of the harbor. Now, here's a pirate that probably an awful lot of you know about. This is when the pirate Sam Bellamy captured the British slave ship called the Widow, which had a huge amount of gold and silver on board because it had just sold 500 slaves in Port Royal. Adding to Bellamy's riches was all the booty that he and his men had gotten from more than 50 vessels that they had plundered during the previous year. However, they wouldn't be able to enjoy the spoils of their success because as they came around the outstretched arm of Cape Cod, a nor'easter came barreling down the coast and sunk the Widow, and about 160 pirates went to the bottom, along with all of that treasure, within about 1,500 feet of the shore, not far from where Marconi Beach is today. For 267 years, the Widow's treasure remained lost, hidden under the waves. But in 1984, salvager and diver Barry Clifford and his team found the Widow and began recovering its treasure. And I heard an earlier story from John that Barry Clifford came here and gave a talk and apparently brought a bunch of his riches that you could run your hands through. I guarantee that if he brought it back today, he wouldn't allow you to do that. It'd be locked up. Now, the item that proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that they had found the Widow was this, the Widow's Bell, which is at the Widow Pirate Museum in West Yarmouth. Now, Clifford and his team had made history unearthing the first authenticated pirate ship and treasure ever found. How much the treasure is worth is hotly debated. Estimates range from an unreasonably low 200,000 to an improbably high 400 million. Now we get to Edward Lowe. I've been doing a lot of radio interviews lately, and once we get past all the args and Hymedes, they always ask me who my favorite pirate is. And I have to rephrase the question because I don't really have a favorite. I find them all to be rather miserable human beings, but I do have some that I think are more fascinating than others, and Lowe ranks right near the top of the list. He was one of the most despicable pirates, and I think he was arguably mentally deranged. He seemed to relish torturing and killing his victims. His signature move was cutting off people's ears and lips, roasting them, and then forcing the victims to eat their own flesh. When I said that, I think it was some interview, and the interviewer said, "You know, Eric, you say that with a little bit too much relish. I'm starting to wonder about you." It is, I don't know what it is about humans, but it is exciting reading about these vicious things. But anyway, when the captain of one of the ships that Lowe captured had the temerity to cut the rope holding a bag of gold and silver so that it sank into the ocean instead of into Lowe's hands, Lowe not only killed the man, but all 32 of his crew members. Another time when Lowe seized a merchant ship that was full of brandy and wine, its captain asked if Lowe would be so kind as to write a few sentences stating that he had taken the liquor so the owner of the ship wouldn't think that the captain had sold it and dishonestly pocketed the profits. Lowe cheerily agreed and said that he would be right back with what the man requested. A few minutes later, Lowe returned with 2 loaded pistols, and presenting one at the captain's bowels, he told the petrified man that this was for his wine and discharged it. And then he pointed the other pistol at the captain's head, saying, "This one is for your brandy," and fired. Lowe is also the pirate who captured a Marblehead, I tried to get Marblehead in here whenever I could, captured a Marblehead fisherman named Phillip Ashton off of Nova Scotia and forced him to be a pirate. But Ashton jumped ship in the Bay of Honduras and he landed on this island, Roatan, which at the time was uninhabited. And Ashton survived there for nearly 2 years, most of it entirely alone. He was picked up by a brigantine from Salem. And when he was deposited back in Marblehead and walked into his parents' house, they nearly fainted because they thought he was long dead. But his story of suffering and endurance became the talk of New England because it took place around 1725 is when he returned. Well, just 6 years before that, a famous writer named Daniel Defoe wrote a book you're probably all familiar with called Robinson Crusoe. Well, Phillip Ashton was America's true life Robinson Crusoe. Now, here's another thing I'm going to have to dispel. I'm sorry I take all the fun out of piracy, but there is no evidence that any pirate from the Golden Age ever forced anybody to walk the plank. Why would they? There are a lot of easier ways to kill people. You can run them through their cutlass, you can shoot them, or you can pitch them over the side of the boat. But to make you feel a little bit better, there are a couple of instances of Chinese pirates in the late 1700s and early 1800s forcing people to walk the plank. And there are at least 2 instances that I know of pirates in the Caribbean, Spanish pirates, in the early 1800s doing the same. Now, this second and very bloody period of piracy came to an end in the mid-1720s when the number of pirates plummeted to an insignificant level. Of the many factors contributing to this decline, one was colonial resolve to fight piracy at sea and in the courts, which resulted in numerous pirates being killed in battle or hanged on land. At well-publicized trials in Boston, Williamsburg, Charleston, and Newport, colonial officials condemned 68 men to the gallows. Another critical determinant was Britain's increased efforts to eliminate pirates throughout the Atlantic, using a combination of pardons, stricter laws, naval force, executions, and the eradication of the pirate stronghold that you've all heard about, Nassau and New Providence in the Bahamas. Now, the last pirates to be hanged during the Golden Age were Captain William Fly and his men, who had plundered a bunch of ships along the coast, but they ran into a problem. They had too many prisoners on board. Some of those prisoners conspired, rose up, killed a number of the pirates, brought Fly and some of his associates back to Boston, where they were tried, found guilty, and hanged at the edge of Boston Harbor in July of 1726. After the execution, their bodies were rowed out to Nix's Mate, which at the time was an island. Now it's just a small navigational beacon. And out there, Fly's associates were buried, but Fly, according to the local Boston paper, was hung up in irons as a spectacle for the warning of others, especially seafaring men, much like Captain Kidd. The warning was hardly necessary. Fly's spectacular, bloody, and brief piratical campaign was the last gasp of the golden age of piracy. And this is where my book ends as well. The pirates depicted in Black Flag's Blue Waters blazed a fiery and unforgettable path through the history of colonial America. For centuries, their turbulent, destructive, and fascinating lives have beguiled, horrified, and entertained us, leaving an indelible and unique mark on our culture. Undoubtedly, there will be more pirate movies, books, and television shows in the future, many of which will perpetuate myths or create them anew. But in the end, there is no need to embellish the history of these pirates, for what they actually did was amazing enough. And I just have one more slide. My daughter, who you saw earlier, is a very good painter. And when I was working on my Lighthouse book, she wanted me to finish. And she figured one way to get me to finish was to paint a painting. She painted a beautiful painting of Edgartown Lighthouse, gave it to me, and said, this is an incentive to get done with this book. So I hung it in my office, and I finished the book. But I decided that we're going to start a tradition. So when I was near the end of this book, my daughter was back from college for the weekend, and I said, I'm almost done. You need to paint something. So this is only a 3x4 inch oil painting. She did this in like a couple hours, and she came back. She said, Dad, here's your painting. And I said, what is it? And she said, it's a pirate ship looking for his next victim. And it is in the book. So I don't know what she's going to paint for my next book, which is a history of hurricanes in America. Maybe a big swirl. But anyway, I really appreciate you coming out on this gray and dark night. And it's fun to be back in Woods Hole, which has a special place in my heart. And thanks for coming out. I'm happy to answer questions.
So we have time for just a few questions, and then Eric is going to be signing books that are available for purchase with cash or check in the lobby. So please wait for the microphones before you ask your question.
Cash or check in the lobby.
So it's quite clear that we romanticize these criminals, and now they're figures of romance. After having studied them, if you look at the contemporary world, could you identify present-day gangsters and criminals that are most likely to receive the same treatment in the future?
That's a good question. Will gangsters and criminals and the pirates of today be looked back on years from now through rose-colored glasses and be romanticized and mythologized? I don't think so. Certainly not the Somali pirates or the Venezuelan pirates that are causing such trouble in the Caribbean this past summer. Certainly we have evidence. Look at Bonnie and Clyde. I mean, that's fairly recent, and they are sort of, they're folk heroes. Dillinger. There is something about human psyche, and probably the people in this audience, even though you study mostly marine things, you probably have insights into human behavior. What is it that causes people to love the bad boys and girls of history? People that do horrific things. There are movies about them, murder mysteries. There's something that is just so compelling. So some of the pirates, or some of the gangsters of today, might be lionized decades from now. But I don't think it'll be like these pirates, unless they're lucky enough or unlucky enough, as the case may be, to have a couple of really talented scribes and Hollywood directors who create these amazing landscapes of piracy. And I really think that the Disney movies in the mid-1900s, Blackbeard, Long John Silver, and also the Errol Flynn movies, just did so much to make pirates be these larger-than-life characters. And then, of course, Johnny Depp. And I just heard there's going to be a sixth Pirates of the Caribbean, perhaps. All I can say is I hope it's better than the last three, which were so far-fetched and crazy. They weren't even fun to watch. So I don't know. I don't have a good answer. I don't know why people are fascinated by such horrible people. There's something in our personalities, human nature.
Yeah, as you're talking about many of the pirates being brought to trial, was this maritime? What law was used? Was it maritime law or was it other?
Admiralty law. They were admiralty courts, basically, in the colonies. And they weren't tried by a jury of their peers. They were tried by a jury of politicians, merchants, and leaders of the community, mainly because there were a few trials before 1700 where there were juries of their peers, and a lot of the peers of pirates liked what they were doing, so they let them off, and the crown finally got really annoyed, so they wanted to take it out of their hands.
I know you dismissed Oak Island, which I had to drag my wife to on our honeymoon. But is there any record of them stashing loot ashore other places at all, really, or were they too busy spending it?
Yeah, it's more the latter. There's no evidence that I'm aware of, or any other pirate researcher that I know of any pirate actually burying their treasure. And there's some very fanciful stories about them doing it. But yes, they often spent it. Many of them didn't accumulate much treasure. But think about it. If you bury treasure, there's no guarantee you're going to make it back. And somebody else might find it. The strangest story of buried treasure is near my hometown of Marblehead. I didn't include it in the book because it just didn't fit in. But there's supposedly a pirate that came into Lynn Cove in the 1650s. And he trudged up to Lynn Woods. And he buried treasure at Dungeon Rock. So in the mid-1800s, the Marble family, who were spiritualists and seance, people, they decided to dig for the treasure that this Captain Veal or Vane left there. And they dug for 10 years, and they actually had a graphic in Scientific American and all this. They were very famous at the time, but they basically lost their marbles, literally, and they lost all their money too. But the thing that's so crazy about this, you can go up to Dungeon Rock today, and you can climb down into the hole 40 feet down into solid granite.
Wow.
They dug a hole out of solid stone, hoping to find a pirate treasure underneath. It's so ludicrous why people were so fascinated by it at the time. But that's probably the strangest story of pirate treasure.
Wow.
But there is pirate treasure. People have found treasure along the beach. Even before Barry Clifford found the actual location of the Whydah, there was this one guy in the early 1900s. He had accumulated 722 pieces of 8 and other coins that obviously probably had been, the surf had brought in eventually.
Question here.
I was just going to ask if you could say something about the Barbary pirates.
I'll say a very little bit because I don't include them in the book, but the Barbary pirates were the pirates off the northwestern horn of Africa in the late 1700s. I mean, they were around a long time. Muslims in the late 1700s and the early 1800s, they caused America, and Thomas Jefferson in particular, a lot of problems because their modus operandi was to capture a ship and ransom them, sort of like the Somali pirates of today. And finally, when America, or the new United States, got powerful enough and started building some frigates and had a navy to speak of, they said, okay, we're not going to pay tribute anymore. We're going to send over a couple of our ships and teach them a lesson. And they ultimately did. And the Barbary pirates were sort of beaten back for a time. And now they've re-emerged on the other side of Africa, I guess, the Somali pirates. But there's some good books written about the Barbary pirates. I don't talk about them. I'm often asked about John Lafitte. I also don't talk about him because my book ends in 1726, but that's another pirate, smuggler, and war hero that has an interesting biography.
Any other questions? If not, there's one here. Okay, we have two. Sorry.
So in the glory days of the piracy, what was in the cases where the crew decided to take a defensive stance, can you comment on what was there any typical approach to the defense? And then also, do you have any thoughts on what fraction of the defenses, succeeded?
Oh, you mean victims?
Yeah, no, what I mean,
The victims of pirates wanting to plunder a ship.
you're the ship captain. You decide we're going to take a stand and defend.
Okay.
So do you have thought, or do you get a good feeling for what kinds of defenses were typical, and then what were the chances of success?
The most common defense was no defense, and almost all.
But for those cases that
It depends on the ship. A lot of these ships were small sloops that had no real armaments, maybe a stern gun to speak of, so they had limited opportunities. Some of these ships, larger merchant ships, would have cannons on board, maybe as many as 10 or 12, and they could put up a fight. There are very few instances that I found of any merchant ships putting up a fight, and there are a couple of instances in which they did that they were overpowered, because you have to remember, a merchant ship that's 100 feet long may have a crew of 15 or 20. A pirate ship that's 100 feet long might have 90 people on board, heavily armed pirates. So the odds were stacked against you. And to maintain their vicious brand identity, every once in a while, pirates would spill blood. And there are actually accounts in local newspapers of the time saying that merchants and mariners will not fight against pirates because they've heard the stories of what they do to those who don't submit. So it didn't happen that often, but it really had to be case specific, because some people are better at fighting, some people have better armaments, some ships were fast. There are ships that got away, that escaped from pirates' clutches. The pirates always wanted to get a ship that was a faster sailer. But if they couldn't sail as fast as the ship they were chasing, the other ship would get away or under cover of darkness. So there are a lot of variations on a theme.
So I have a question on behalf of someone else, and that is, did pirates ever take any of their family aboard their ships with them?
No, it's not like whaling ships where, whaling wives and family would often come along in the mid-1800s. I didn't find a single instance, other than maybe Calico Jack Rackham, who happened to have his lover on board, but she was a fellow pirate, of pirates taking their families. In fact, the vast, vast majority of pirates after the 1700s probably didn't have a wife or family, or if they did, they didn't care much about them. The ones before the 1700s that came back to the colonies and were part of colonial fabric, many of them were married. But just like whaling captains from Nantucket or Martha's Vineyard in the 1700s, they would leave their wives and family behind and come back, 2-4 years later. The pirates would do the same thing. They'd go to the Indian Ocean, 5 or 6 months, they'd plunder, and then they'd come back. They even sent letters. There was a mail packet almost. There were merchants from New York and some of the other colonies who would send ships to Madagascar to sell stuff to the pirates. And then they would bring them back for 100 pieces of 8 a head. And they would also bring back letters. And there were these touching letters written by pirates who had just done horrific things to their loved ones back home, and letters from their loved ones that go to Madagascar. It's just like in whaling world, it's like the Galapagos Island post office that they used to get information back and forth. So it was a very different kind of piracy prior to 1700 and after 1700.
Any other questions? Well, if not, before we thank him again, I'd like to remind you, the friends of the MBL, we want more friends, as many friends as possible. So consider it. Consider donating. And Eric, thank you very much again.
You're welcome.